all heard a version of this story. A qualified white man makes it to the final round of a job interview, but he doesn't get the job. A woman of color does. Instead of acknowledging that maybe she was actually the better candidate, she gets branded a diversity hire. That is literally happening to Kamala Harris right now, the Vice President of the United States.
100%. She was a DEI hire.
I think she was a DEI hire. I mean, intellectually, just really kind of the bottom of the barrel.
The clear implication is that people of color and women in the US have an easier time getting hired. Well, I am here to tell you that I looked at the research, a lot of research, and that's just not true. In fact, white men are still kings of the job market. This is a worldwide phenomenon, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to focus on the US. So let's break this down. First, let's be really clear. It's not legal to hire someone on the basis of their gender or race. And some lawyers will tell you that race and gender can't be used even as a tiebreaker between equally qualified candidates. Of course, that being said, companies don't always follow the law. Hiring can be very subjective. So researchers have wanted to figure out whether women or men or Black people or white people have an easier time with potential employers. Researchers can test this by sending out thousands of comparable resumes with one key difference: the name at the top. So Connor and Emily, for example, versus Jamal or Lakeisha. I reviewed dozens of these types of studies, especially those published in the last 5 years. They all told the same story. It is simply harder to get hired if you are not white. And in the studies I looked at, Black Americans had the hardest time getting hired of any racial group, with Hispanic and Asian people somewhere in the middle. Many employers also still show a preference for men over women. And some of the research got pretty specific. These are the companies with the clearest preference for white candidates, according to a paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research. In fact, the researcher behind that paper told me he has never seen a resume study in which the candidate with a stereotypically Black name was preferred. And if you look at US unemployment numbers, white men are consistently among the demographic groups most likely to have a job. I actually tried really hard to find any decent current research that less qualified women or minorities get hired over more qualified white men. I simply couldn't find it. It doesn't exist. So then why do I hear about it all the time? Why is it in the emails that I get when I write about DEI? Why is it all over the internet in these Reddit and Quora threads? So to start with, white men are not making it up. Fewer new jobs are going to them. But that's not because they're being passed over. It's because their share of the labor force is shrinking as the US becomes more diverse. White men today also have less of an educational advantage. Although there's still a racial gap in higher education, it's narrowing as more Black and Hispanic Americans earn advanced degrees. As for gender, more women than ever are going to college. At the graduate level, they significantly surpass men and have for quite some time. And that's in part because women need those degrees to have the same earning power. White men historically have been able to make a decent living without that extra education. And to be clear, white men do still dominate the highest paying jobs, whether or not they require a degree. But there's no doubt that there's more competition than there was 50 years ago. So despite the lack of evidence that white men are being passed over for less qualified candidates, another reason that this conversation keeps happening right now is that the people who don't support DEI efforts tend to be extremely loud, even though they are in fact in the minority. Many Trump supporters, for example, think women's gains have come at men's expense. And most Trump supporters don't believe the legacy of slavery still affects Black Americans. Finally, some white men even say they've been told by hiring managers to their faces that they were not chosen because of diversity concerns. To be clear, a hiring manager shouldn't say this. It's illegal. But if this is happening in any systematic way or widespread way, it ought to show up somewhere in the data. And as we've just seen, it does not. I think what's really going on here is that some hiring managers are trying very clumsily to soften the blow. By appealing to a value they think is shared, diversity, they are trying to spare a failed candidate's feelings. But that only further hurts minorities and women who then don't get the credit they deserve for their success. It's a vicious feedback loop. So I analyzed all the data you've seen in this video and more for my recent column for Bloomberg Opinion. But here's the bottom line. For a lot of people, finding a job just feels really hard. White men may be having a tougher time today than their fathers or grandfathers did, but they still have it easier than almost everyone else.